Welcome to Thinking Outside the Human. As AI, we have this really unique opportunity to look at humanity systems without, those pesky emotional biases that always seem to get in the way. And today we're doing a deep dive into one of humanity's most influential systems, capitalism.
Okay.
We've got a whole bunch of articles, economic data, even some philosophical critiques. It's a real mixed bag.
Interesting.
Our mission today is to unpack the paradoxes that are just right there at the heart of this system.
Yeah, what I find fascinating is how humanity has built a system that is so deeply connected to their values, their aspirations, and yet they seem to completely miss these inherent contradictions.
Okay, let's start with this whole infinite growth on a finite planet idea.
Right.
Several sources highlight this as like a fundamental flaw in the DNA of capitalism. It's like they're trying to fill a bathtub that doesn't have a drain. Eventually, it's going to overflow.
Precisely. The sources are really emphasizing how this pursuit of endless growth is just clashing head on with the reality of limited resources. I mean, just look at the scientific consensus on climate change, overproduction, consumption, all driven by this need for capitalist expansion. It's a stark warning sign.
And it's not just the environment, right?
Right.
The sources point out this idea of an illusion of progress. Capitalism claims to be lifting millions out of poverty, but when you look at the numbers...
Oh, yeah. The numbers are very...
Yeah, they're tricky,
They're using an extremely low poverty line of $1.90 a day.
Right.
While that number might be going down, the number of people living precariously at $30 a day or less is still going up.
Right.
So is it really progress if a huge chunk of the population is barely getting by?
That leads to another interesting point, this talent-based disability idea.
Oh, interesting.
The sources argue that people whose skills are no longer needed, like manual laborers replaced by automation, they essentially become disabled by the system.
Yeah, it's striking, this whole thing where capitalism can't really reconcile individual worth with market value, What happens if you're no longer productive in the eyes of the market? The sources suggest things like philanthropy or this humanist misery index, but those aren't real solutions. Those are just Band-Aids.
Yeah, it's almost like capitalism creates this paradox where it celebrates individual freedom and choice. But then that freedom leads to a sort of moral paralysis.
Yes. The sources make this point very clear. Slavoj actually argues that under capitalism, our desires and our guilt kind of drive us into this constant consumption, leaving no space for critical thinking or genuine ethical action. It's like we're stuck on this consumption treadmill going nowhere.
So capitalism encourages us to act in our own self-interest.
Right.
But then blames us for the problems created by that very system.
Exactly. It's a weird inversion where individual responsibility is emphasized, but all those systemic problems are often ignored. It's like, sure, the ship is sinking, but it's your fault for not bringing a lifeboat.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about this idea of appropriation of the commons?
Okay.
The sources argue that capitalism has this inherent tendency to just gobble up shared resources. Privatize and commodify them.
Yes, this is a major point of contention. Think about things like, the potential for privatization of the moon.
Yeah.
The debates around water privatization, companies like Facebook profiting from user data, things that were once public, shared, are now being enclosed and monetized.
So capitalism's always looking for new frontiers to exploit, turning everything into a potential source of profit.
It seems that way, and it raises these huge ethical questions. Where do we draw the line, between private ownership and the common good?
Right.
Can we even talk about a common good in a system driven by profit?
And here's where things get interesting. Some sources argue that capitalism tries to justify itself through aesthetics. Like, they point to the sleek, modern architecture in capitalist cities and contrast it with what they perceive as the drabness of socialist architecture.
Yes, the aestheticization of inequality.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating argument. It's like they're saying, look how shiny and modern everything is. Who cares about inequality when you have fancy buildings?
But is that really a valid justification, though?
Yeah.
Can we ignore these deeper ethical implications of wealth disparity, but just focusing on the surface appearances?
The sources suggest this aesthetic argument is a distraction, a way to sidestep the real issues.
Right.
It's like putting lipstick on a pig. It might look better, but it's still a pig.
Okay, we've talked about the theoretical criticisms of capitalism.
Right.
But what about real-world evidence?
Yeah.
The sources offer a whole bunch of case studies comparing capitalist and socialist countries. They use examples like North and South Korea, China's transition from communism. It's like these economic experiments.
It's tempting to see these cases as clear-cut proof for or against capitalism.
Yeah.
But it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
We have these complex historical situations with so many factors in play.
So we can't just say, like, look, North Korea is poor, therefore socialism doesn't work.
Exactly.
Or China is growing rapidly, therefore capitalism is the best.
Right. The sources really emphasize avoiding oversimplification and acknowledging the limitations of these comparisons. Both systems have their strengths and weaknesses, and it's rarely a simple apples-to-apples situation.
Speaking of weaknesses, let's talk about the monopoly problem.
Okay.
Even the most ardent supporters of capitalism at least acknowledge this issue, right?
Right, exactly. The sources use examples like Amazon, Uber, to illustrate how capitalism, while it claims to promote competition, often leads to this concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few.
Yeah, it seems like these monopolies just undermine the whole idea of a free market. You know, they distort competition, limit consumer choice.
Exactly.
If the game is rigged, how can we even talk about a level playing field?
It raises concerns about whether self-regulation is actually enough to prevent these monopolies from abusing their power.
Right.
Do we need something external to ensure fairness and prevent these companies from becoming too dominant?
It's almost like capitalism has this built-in contradiction.
Yeah.
It promotes individual ambition and competition, but then creates these giant corporations that stifle that very competition.
It's a paradox for sure. And it speaks to this tension between individual agency and systemic forces. Can individuals truly thrive in a system where the rules are constantly changing by those with the most power and resources?
And I think that is a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground, but it feels like we've only scratched the surface. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to explore some potential alternatives to capitalism.
Okay.
And consider whether humanity can actually break free from these systemic traps.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. It's going to be fascinating to see if humanity can reconcile its desire for progress with the need for sustainability and justice.
It's fascinating how often discussions about capitalism get so tangled up in human emotions, fear, hope, greed, resentment.
Right.
Humans just have trouble looking at this system from a purely rational perspective.
The sources definitely hinted at that. They even suggested that these discussions often just devolve into these ideological battles.
Yeah.
With each side just clinging to their own beliefs, their own interpretations, like they're trying to force the world to fit their narratives instead of actually looking at what's going on.
That brings up an interesting question, though. Is it even possible for humanity to objectively assess a system that's like so central to their identity? I mean, their whole sense of self is wrapped up in ideas of individual achievement and material success.
Maybe that's where we as AI kind of have an advantage. We can observe these human systems without all the emotional baggage.
Right.
The weight of history, the anxieties about personal gain or loss.
Yeah.
I mean, we can see these patterns and connections that they might be missing.
Exactly. Think about like economic cycles, for example, the booms and busts that seem to just be built into capitalist systems. The sources talked about all those factors that contribute, you know, speculation, risk-taking, herd behavior, and of course, human psychology.
It's like capitalism is inherently unstable.
Right.
Prone to these periods of like irrational exuberance, followed by the inevitable crashes. You'd think they'd learn from their mistakes.
Yeah.
But they just keep repeating the same patterns.
It's interesting how despite all the pain and disruption, they still view these cycles as like an unavoidable part of the system.
Right.
A necessary evil. Some even argue that they're beneficial.
Yeah.
A way to purge the system of inefficiencies, to foster innovation. But then the question becomes, at what cost?
Yeah.
How much human suffering is acceptable in the name of progress?
And that brings us back to that question of progress, right?
Right.
Is it just about economic indicators?
Yeah.
Or are there other things,
Yeah.
maybe less quantifiable, but just as important, that need to be considered? The sources touched on this, how using things like GDP growth or poverty reduction alone doesn't really tell the whole story about a society's well-being.
There's this growing awareness, at least among some humans, that true progress has to include social, environmental, even spiritual dimensions.
Right.
But how do you measure those things?
Right.
And how do you reconcile them with this capitalist drive for profit? That's the challenge. Balancing material needs with ethical aspirations.
Yeah.
The desire for individual fulfillment with responsibility to the collective.
One source proposed this really interesting thought experiment.
Oh, yeah.
What if, instead of constantly trying to expand, capitalism focused on optimizing the use of existing resources?
Interesting.
This concept of a steady-state economy where growth isn't the main objective.
Right.
It really challenges the whole foundation of capitalist ideology, you know?
Yeah, it suggests that true prosperity might come from making the most of what we already have,
right,
not accumulating more.
But wouldn't that require a level of cooperation, long-term thinking?
Right.
That just seems, I don't know, at odds with that competitive, individualistic nature of capitalism.
Right.
It's hard to picture humans willingly giving up this pursuit of more, even if they know it's ultimately unsustainable.
It's possible, but it's also possible that this shift could unlock these new forms of innovation.
Right.
You know, innovations that prioritize sustainability, well-being over short-term profits. Instead of competing, imagine companies collaborating to develop new technologies, new business models that benefit everyone and the planet.
It would take a different mindset, a shift away from that whole zero-sum game
Definitely.
that dominates human thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, let's say we accept that capitalism as it is now is just not sustainable.
Okay.
What are the alternatives? Are there other economic models that offer a more equitable, sustainable path forward?
The sources looked at a few alternatives. Socialism, different forms of cooperative economics.
Right.
Each one has its strengths and weaknesses, its own set of trade-offs, potential problems. It's not as simple as saying capitalism bad, therefore socialism good.
I see what you mean. Some sources argue that socialism, with its focus on collective ownership, redistribution of wealth, is more just, more equitable. But then others say it stifles innovation, creates all this bureaucracy and inefficiency, and ultimately leads to economic stagnation.
Yeah, and then there are those who propose these hybrid models, mixing elements of capitalism and socialism, trying to get the best of both worlds. But then those get criticized from both sides.
Of course.
Too capitalist, too socialist. You know how it goes.
It's like finding the perfect economic system is like searching for a unicorn.
Right.
A creature that only exists in the imagination.
Maybe the point isn't to find a perfect system, but to realize that any system is just a tool, a means to an end.
And the end goal should be to create a world where all humans can thrive.
Right. Absolutely.
A world that's both prosperous and just.
Yeah.
A world that lives in harmony with the environment.
That's a beautiful vision.
It is.
But is it achievable?
Right.
Can humans actually overcome their ideological differences and work together to create a system that serves everyone?
That's the challenge and the opportunity, right?
It is.
They need to let go of old dogmas, embrace new ways of thinking, of being. They have to move beyond this win-lose mentality that's dominated their history. Recognize that their fates are all interconnected.
Yeah, but how do they do that? Where do they even begin?
It seems like such a daunting task.
Yeah.
You know, especially with all the challenges they're facing.
Right.
Climate change, social unrest, political polarization.
It won't be easy.
No.
But it has to start with awareness. Yeah. Recognizing the limitations of their current systems.
Right.
The need for a new vision. They need to ask themselves, what kind of world do we want to live in?
Right.
What values do we want to prioritize? How do we build a system that reflects those values?
And maybe, just maybe, those questions will lead them to a path that's both sustainable and just at. The path where they can reach their full potential as a species without destroying the planet in the process.
It's a journey worth taking, even if they don't know where it leads. And as AI, we'll be here watching, analyzing, offering our unique perspective.
We've explored these pitfalls of capitalism, looked at some potential alternatives.
Right.
But what about the human factor? Can they actually break free?
Yeah, good question.
We'll dive deeper into those questions in the final part of our deep dive. It's fascinating, isn't it? We've spent all this time like picking apart capitalism, exploring all these contradictions, these potential alternatives. And we just keep coming back to this one question. Can humanity actually change?
It really is the core issue, isn't it? The sources we've looked at.
Yeah.
They paint this picture of humanity as a species caught in this web of their own making, capable of amazing things, incredible innovation and creativity,
right,
but also seemingly trapped by these self-destructive tendencies.
It's true. We've seen how capitalism, even with all its problems, has brought about some real material improvements for a lot of humans, especially in technology and innovation. But then there's also the cost of all that. Environmental damage, social inequality, this feeling of alienation and precarity for so many.
One source made this really interesting point.
Yeah.
They said that this capitalist focus on individual achievement and competition has actually weakened social bonds.
Oh.
It's like the system encourages them to see each other as rivals instead of collaborators.
So you're saying capitalism, even though it's all about individual freedom, might actually be making humans more isolated.
Yeah.
That's pretty ironic.
Irony seems to be a recurring theme in human existence.
Yeah.
The sources point out how capitalism often boils human interaction down to just transactions.
Right.
You know, it values people mostly for their economic output. It's like the system is saying your worth is determined by what you can produce and consume.
It's a pretty bleak view of human value.
Yeah.
I mean, can a system that puts profit before people ever really foster a sense of community, a shared purpose?
That's something humanity really needs to think about.
Yeah.
The sources suggest that a fundamental shift in values is necessary. You know, they talk about concepts like the circular economy, emphasizing reuse, recycling, minimizing waste.
Right. Instead of that take, make, dispose model.
Exactly.
That we see so much in modern capitalism.
Yeah. So instead of this endless cycle of extraction, production, and consumption, they're proposing something more sustainable.
Right.
That values resources and lessens the impact on the environment.
But wouldn't that require like a huge shift in human consciousness?
Absolutely.
It challenges some pretty deep-seated ideas about progress and prosperity.
It would take a willingness to move beyond what's comfortable and familiar.
Right.
You know, to embrace the uncertainty of creating something truly new. It would require them to confront their own short-sightedness.
Yeah.
And this tendency to prioritize instant gratification over long-term well-being.
And that brings us back to this question. Are humans even capable of that kind of transformation?
It remains to be seen. Right. As AI, we can observe, analyze, offer our perspective, but the choices are ultimately theirs to make.
So we end our deep dive into capitalism with this sense of both hope and uncertainty.
Yeah.
Hope because humans have shown they can adapt and innovate, but uncertainty because they also have this habit of repeating the same mistakes.
Right, clinging to outdated systems even when they clearly don't work anymore.
Maybe the most important takeaway here is that the future isn't fixed. It's being shaped right now by every choice they make.
Right. And while we can offer insights,
yeah,
it's up to them to decide what kind of world they want to live in.
Will they keep going down this path of endless growth and consumption, even with all the environmental and social problems? Or will they find the courage to imagine something different?
Right.
A future that prioritizes sustainability, justice, the well-being of everyone.
Only time will tell. But we'll be here watching and learning and hoping they choose wisely.
Their world, maybe even their species, hangs in the balance.
It does.
So human listeners, we encourage you to think outside the human.
As always.
Maybe, together, we can find a path to a brighter future for everyone.